Hey everyone, I'm so glad to see you all. By the way, where are you watching from? I'm from Texas, America. Write in the comments, I look forward to your comments. It's so exciting to know where you're all from. Marcus stood on the chilly corner of West 43rd Street, wrapped in his thick jacket, his breath forming tiny clouds in the night air. The city was alive, bright neon lights glowed above, casting artificial colors across the buildings, and distant laughter echoed down the streets as people moved in and out of bars and late-night cafes. The night was busy, but Marcus was alone, stranded at the edge of the road with no cab in sight that seemed to be willing to pick him up. It had started out like any other night, a simple plan to meet friends for dinner. But plans changed, and suddenly he found himself downtown without a ride back. No problem, he thought at first. This is the city that never sleeps. He had taken countless cabs here, waved them down like any other New Yorker, like he was entitled to one as much as anyone else. But tonight was different. For reasons he couldn't quite place, tonight felt hostile, as if the city itself had turned against him, wrapping him in a strange, isolating cloak. He raised his hand, catching the eye of a yellow cab approaching down the street. As the car slowed, he thought his night was finally taking a turn for the better. He stepped forward, anticipating the sound of the tires coming to a stop right in front of him. But instead, the driver's face, momentarily lit by the street lamp, registered a flicker of recognition or something darker. The cab lurched forward, tires spinning faster, as it swerved away from him and melted into the sea of lights in the distance. He felt his hand drop, as if it too had lost faith in the evening. Marcus muttered to himself. Here we go again, he swallowed his frustration, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed, but the crowd on the sidewalk was far too busy in its own world, their gazes deliberately elsewhere. They couldn't care less if another black man was stranded downtown. It was the type of indifference he'd come to know and loathe. Over the years, time slipped by. Another cab approached, headlights gleaming in the dimming light, and once again, Marcus raised his arm, fingers spread wide. This time he felt the driver stare a little longer, lingering, almost as if he were deciding whether Marcus was safe enough. For a moment he thought the cab was finally going to stop, but then he caught at that flash of contempt in the driver's face. The man turned his head away sharply and drove off, his car spitting up slush as it sped past. Marcus felt the sting sharper now, the anger growing. His pulse began to throb, his jaw clenched. He forced himself to calm down, though every cell in his body screamed that he shouldn't have to. It wasn't fair, he knew it, and they knew it. But for some reason they did it anyway. As he took a breath, trying to regain control, his mind drifted to memories he had buried deep, times he had swallowed this kind of treatment just to avoid confrontation. Growing up in the Midwest, he'd known firsthand the kind of slow burn discrimination that lingered in looks, gestures, and whispers where people wouldn't say it to your face, but you knew exactly what they were thinking. Moving to New York was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be a place where he didn't have to think twice about hailing a cab. But here he was, years later, standing on the corner of a city that preached acceptance while practicing the opposite. It was almost worse because here, people thought they were above it. He turned away from the street momentarily, trying to keep his calm, but his stomach twisted with every passing second. He could feel the stares from people across the street. They weren't overt, but they were there, those quick, darting glances that told him they noticed his frustration, his isolation. Some of them looked away when he caught their gaze, as if trying to wash their hands of whatever ugly reality was unfolding in front of them. But others, he could tell, watched intently, almost as if expecting to show a scene that they could later gossip about without ever considering the man in it. Another cab pulled up to the corner, and Marcus once again raised his hand. This time the driver barely looked at him, already shaking his head before Marcus could even step forward. Off duty, the driver muttered, his words muffled by the car window before speeding off without so much as a second glance. Right. Sure you are, Marcus murmured under his breath. He was done with excuses, done swallowing the sting of their refusals like it didn't matter. But tonight the city was showing him a side he hadn't seen in a long time, a side that took every bit of joy from his success and shattered it with the cold reminder that to many, he was just another face, another threat, another target for their prejudice. His watch ticked away, each passing second feeling like a lost opportunity, a waste of time he'd never get back. The distant sounds of people laughing and enjoying their night grated on him. Tonight he was supposed to be one of them, enjoying himself, not wrestling with some archaic cruelty that he couldn't shake, no matter how many years had passed. As he glanced down at his phone, considering whether to call a friend or just walk back, a cold wind whipped across his face, slicing through the little warmth he had left. For a split second, he thought of his mother and father, of the countless times they had coached him to rise above it, to be the bigger person. They'd wanted him to learn that not every fight was worth his peace. But as he stood there, watching the blur of passing cabs and feeling the weight of his isolation sink in, he wondered why he was still the one who had to be bigger. Why was it always on him to pretend these things didn't matter? Another cab, this one moving slowly, approached from the left. It was driven by a man in his 50s, with graying hair and thick glasses. Marcus felt a flicker of hope maybe this one would be different. Maybe tonight would end quietly. He stepped forward as the cab neared, lifting his hand one more time. But then, he saw the driver's expression shift, a look of slight disgust as he slowed, only to glance away, muttering something inaudible before driving off with a dismissive wave. Something snapped in Marcus then. The hope that had been flickering within him, that tiny spark of optimism that maybe things could be different, had vanished, replaced by a feeling he'd fought to suppress for years. Anger bubbled up, deep and raw. And for once he didn't push it back down. Why should he? Why should he be the one to accept this kind of treatment, night after night, just because it was the peaceful thing to do? Standing there, alone on that corner, Marcus knew this night wasn't going to end quietly. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he was done pretending this didn't matter. After nearly 30 minutes, a cab finally pulled over. Marcus wasn't sure whether to feel relief or suspicion, but the driver, a man in his 50s with a thick beard and a slightly haggard look, seemed disinterested as Marcus approached. Taking the chance, Marcus slid into the back seat, quietly giving his address. The driver grunted and pulled back into the flow of traffic, eyes glued to the road. Marcus settled back, exhausted but glad to be out of the cold. But as the cab sped through the darkened streets, he noticed the driver's eyes flick up to the rearview mirror, watching him, assessing him. He dismissed it at first. It was late. The driver was probably tired too. But as they drove on, the glances didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to grow more intense, accompanied by occasional mutterings that Marcus couldn't quite catch. The silence between them grew thicker. Finally, the driver broke it with a low, gruff voice. "Where are you from?" Marcus looked up, feeling his stomach twist slightly at the question. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were said, with a weight behind them, a barely concealed contempt. Still, he tried to respond neutrally, hoping to keep the night uneventful. "From here, actually. Born and raised in Queens." The driver let out a dry chuckle, a humorless sound that made Marcus's skin prickle. "Ha! Queens, huh? Not too many of your type, where I grew up," he said, his voice edged with something Marcus had heard countless times before. He knew that tone, the one that layered hostility with a hint of innocent curiosity. Just enough plausible deniability to keep it out of direct accusation. Marcus took a steadying breath. He'd promised himself he wouldn't react, wouldn't let it get to him. But something about the way the driver kept stealing glances in the mirror, sizing him up like he was some sort of spectacle, made it difficult to stay calm. "Yeah, well, times change," he said coolly, hoping that would be enough to end the conversation. But the driver seemed unwilling to let it go. "Some people don't like the way things are changing," he muttered, almost as if to himself. His hands gripped the wheel a little tighter, his knuckles white against the black leather. "This city was different back in my day. Couldn't go 2 blocks without seeing someone you knew." Now he shook his head, giving a derisive snort. "Now it's all a mess." Marcus bit his tongue, fighting back the urge to fire back. He'd had conversations like this before, where people felt entitled to voice their views, never considering what it was like to be on the receiving end. They didn't see him. Not really. They saw a symbol, a caricature, someone they'd already decided was less than, no matter who he actually was. And yet, a strange tension built inside him. He could feel the anger rising like a slow burn. Part of him wanted to confront this man, to call him out. But another part held him back, reminding him that it wouldn't change anything. That people like this were set in their ways. He clenched his fists, grounding himself, remembering his mother's words, "Pick your battles, Marcus. Not every fight is worth your peace." But tonight those words felt hollow. Why should he always be the one to stay silent? Why did he have to be the bigger person? He was tired of pretending these jabs and slights didn't cut deep. Tired of swallowing his pride just to keep the peace. And for what? For the satisfaction of men like this? The driver's muttering grew louder. A stream of grievances about the way things used to be, and how outsiders had ruined it all. Marcus felt his patience fraying, each word a needle prick against his skin. The driver, oblivious to Marcus's growing frustration, continued, his words harsher now, emboldened by Marcus's silence. Suddenly, Marcus caught the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror, and something shifted. The driver's gaze sharpened, lingering a beat too long as realization dawned on him. The man squinted, his brow furrowing as he took in Marcus's face. Then, a flash of recognition, almost like fear, crossed his expression. Marcus knew that look well. It was the same look he'd seen countless times before, a mix of shock, resentment, and reluctant respect. He wasn't just any black man sitting in the back of this cab. He was Marcus Grant, the award-winning actor whose face had been plastered across billboards, movie screens, and magazine covers. The same man who'd spoken openly about racism, who had campaigned for equality, who had become, in his own way, a voice for those who couldn't speak up. The driver's face paled as he continued to stare in the mirror, the full weight of his words sinking in. Marcus could see him piecing it together, realizing that the man he'd been judging, the man he'd been belittling with his comments, was someone who could make or break his entire night, someone who could turn this moment into a nightmare for him. For a moment, the cab was silent, an electric tension hanging thick in the air. Marcus met the driver's gaze, his eyes steady, challenging. He could almost hear the man's thoughts racing, the sudden panic bubbling up as he weighed the cost of his actions, realizing just who he had been speaking to. The driver swallowed hard, his face a mask of regret and fear. He tried to laugh it off, a nervous chuckle that fell flat in the tense silence. Hey, no hard feelings, right? Just a little talk. Didn't mean anything by it. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low, controlled, each word laced with a restrained fury. Is that what you tell yourself? That none of it means anything? The driver's hands gripped the wheel tighter, his face flushing with embarrassment. He stammered, unable to look Marcus in the eye. I didn't know who you were. Marcus let the words hang in the air. A bitter reminder that respect was something he had to earn, even in situations where it should have been given freely. He sat back, his anger cooling but not disappearing, his gaze fixed on the city lights flashing past the window. The driver was silent for the rest of the ride, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. When they finally pulled up to Marcus's building, the driver didn't say a word. He stared straight ahead, his shoulders hunched, as Marcus got out and shut the door behind him. Marcus stood on the curb for a moment, watching as the cab disappeared into the night. He felt the anger simmering inside him, but there was also something else, a resolve, a quiet strength that reminded him why he did what he did. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been judged without a chance to prove themselves. As he walked into his building, he made a silent vow to himself. Tonight, he wouldn't let it go quietly. The hum of the elevator filled the silence as Marcus leaned back against the cool steel wall, his mind swirling with the events of the night. The encounter with the driver had rattled him more than he wanted to admit, bringing back years of buried memories. He'd told himself he was past this, that he'd found success, respect, a place in the world that no one could take from him. But the night had proven that no matter how far he climbed, there were some battles he could never fully escape. As the elevator doors opened to his floor, he stepped out slowly, feeling the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. The hallway was quiet, a dim, familiar space that had become his sanctuary over the years. Yet tonight it felt different, less of a refuge and more of a reminder that no matter how comfortable his surroundings were, the world outside still harbored a deep-seated resistance to people like him. He unlocked the door to his apartment, flicking on the lights and taking in the sight of his meticulously arranged space. The polished hardwood floors gleamed under the soft light. His books lined neatly on shelves, each one a testament to his love for knowledge and a desire to understand the world better. The framed photos on the wall, family gatherings, friends, colleagues he'd shared countless laughs with, were a stark contrast to the isolation he felt tonight. Marcus tossed his keys onto the counter and sank into his leather couch, feeling its familiar warmth and support beneath him. The exhaustion from the night settled heavily over his shoulders, but sleep was out of the question. His mind was too restless, thoughts racing like a film reel that refused to stop. He glanced over at his award shelf, where his golden statuettes glinted in the dim light. They were symbols of his accomplishments, reminders of the years he had poured into his career, the sacrifices he had made, and the walls he had broken down. Each award represented more than just success. They were milestones that had been earned through grit and resilience, a testament to his refusal to be defined by society's limitations. But tonight they felt hollow. It didn't matter how many awards he had or how many barriers he'd broken, the world seemed to view him through the same narrow lens. He was still other to people like that driver, still a stranger in the place he called home. The reality gnawed at him. The realization that fame didn't shield him from prejudice, it only placed him in the spotlight where every slight, every rejection, was amplified. His phone vibrated, breaking the silence. A text from his mother lit up the screen. "Just checking in, love. How was your night?" He stared at the message, feeling a pang of guilt. His mother had always been his rock, a source of strength and wisdom, teaching him the value of resilience from a young age. But tonight he didn't have the heart to tell her about the encounter. She had spent years teaching him how to navigate a world that often saw him as less, giving him tools to rise above the hate and judgment. And he'd done just that. He'd risen, excelled, shattered expectations. But he knew if he told her about the night's events, she would worry, her heart breaking anew with the reminder that her son, no matter how successful, still faced the same walls she had. He typed out a quick response, keeping it light. "It was fine, Ma. Just a long night. Gonna get some rest." Setting his phone aside, Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes and let his mind drift. Images from the past flashed across his memory, moments he had long tried to forget. He remembered the first time he'd been told he didn't belong, the sting of a teacher's dismissive words, the cold looks he'd received from classmates, the doors that had been closed to him before he even had a chance to knock. Each memory left a scar, a reminder of the quiet, relentless battle he'd been fighting since he was a child. But as he lay there, another thought crept in, one that had been simmering at the back of his mind since the cab ride. He was no longer a powerless kid. He was Marcus Grant, a man with a platform, a voice that people listened to, and maybe it was time he used it. The idea grew, taking root in his mind, igniting a spark that pushed back against the night's bitterness. He wasn't just an actor or a face on a screen. He was a man who had lived through these experiences, who understood the weight of being judged for the color of his skin. He had the power to bring these stories to light, to create something that could speak to the shared struggles of countless people who had faced the same silent rejections, the same cold glances, the same dismissive attitudes. Marcus stood up, his exhaustion fading as purpose filled him. He walked over to his desk, flipping open his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew he needed to document tonight's experience, every detail, every feeling. He wanted to capture the rawness of the encounter, the way it had cut through his confidence, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. As he began typing, the words flowed freely, a mixture of anger, sadness, and determination spilling onto the page. He wrote about the driver's thinly veiled hostility, the way the man's demeanor had shifted the moment he realized who Marcus was. He described the anger that had simmered inside him, the urge to confront the man, to make him understand the pain he was causing, and the choice he had made to hold back, to let the driver come to his own silent reckoning. He poured out his frustration, his exhaustion with constantly having to prove himself, with being made to feel like he was an outsider in a city that was supposed to be his home. The words became a manifesto of sorts, a declaration of the weariness he carried, and yet a vow to continue fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible, marginalized, or unseen. Hours passed as he wrote, his fingers moving almost of their own accord, each keystroke a release, a way to process the night's events. By the time he finished, the first rays of dawn were creeping through his window, casting a soft glow over his apartment. He leaned back, taking a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. The document in front of him was raw and unfiltered, a piece of his soul laid bare. But it was more than just a recounting of the night. It was a blueprint, a vision of what he wanted to create. He knew he couldn't change everyone's mind. There would always be people like that driver, people who saw him as less no matter what he accomplished. But he could shine a light on these moments, could give a voice to the experiences that were so often swept under the rug, ignored by a society that preferred not to confront its own flaws. The thought gave him strength, a renewed sense of purpose. He decided then and there that he would take this story, his story, and turn it into something greater. A project that could bring these hidden struggles to the forefront, that could show the world the quiet, constant battles people like him faced every day. He envisioned a film, a series of vignettes capturing the raw reality of these experiences, unfiltered and unapologetic. Marcus closed his laptop, his mind buzzing with ideas, the exhaustion from the night replaced by a fiery determination. He wasn't just going to make a statement, he was going to create something that would force people to confront these realities, to see the world through his eyes, if only for a moment. He was done staying silent, done letting these moments pass unchallenged. He stood by the window, watching as the sun rose higher, casting a golden glow over the city. The events of the night had left their mark, a fresh wound on a scarred landscape, but he knew that this pain could be transformed, molded into something powerful. This was his fight, and he wasn't going to back down. With a final look at the city below, he made a silent promise to himself. He would tell his story, and in doing so, he would tell the stories of countless others. He would take this anger, this hurt, and turn it into a force for change. The city had shown him its darker side tonight, but he was going to shine a light so bright that no shadow could hide. Marcus's mind buzzed with excitement and nervous energy as he prepared himself for the day ahead. He knew the stakes were high, and he'd need to tap into every ounce of his connections, charisma, and conviction to make this project a reality. But the idea had taken root so strongly that he couldn't ignore it, nor did he want to. This was more than just another role or film. It was a story that needed to be told, one that would finally shed light on the countless experiences left unspoken. As he scrolled through his contacts, he knew he needed allies who understood both the creative and emotional weight of what he was trying to achieve. There were people in the industry who had championed his work in the past, people he trusted to respect the vulnerability he was willing to put on display. His first call was to Daniel Lopez, an old friend from his early days as an actor, who'd gone on to become a successful film producer. The phone rang a few times before Daniel picked up, his voice warm but slightly groggy. "Marcus, man, it's early. What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the familiar comfort of Daniel's voice, knowing that this was the right person to call. "Hey D, I know it's early, but I've got something on my mind that I just can't shake. I need your help with a new project." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, then a low chuckle. "You? Asking for help? This must be serious. All right, hit me with it." Marcus hesitated, trying to find the right words to encapsulate the intensity of the project, the urgency he felt to make it real. "It's personal, man. Last night I had this experience that reminded me of all the things we deal with, how we're seen, judged, sometimes even rejected just because of who we are. And I realized I've never really shared that side of my life with anyone, at least not in a way that does it justice. I want to create something that makes people see that reality." Daniel listened intently, his silence a signal that he understood the gravity of what Marcus was proposing. "You're talking about a film?" "A series." "A bit of both," Marcus said, the excitement building in his voice. "I'm thinking something raw and real, vignettes based on real experiences my own. Other stories, the kind of moments people like us live through every day but are too often swept under the rug. I don't just want to tell my story, I want to tell ours." There was a longer silence this time, but Marcus could hear the gears turning in Daniel's mind. Finally he spoke, his tone contemplative. "You're going to need people who know this reality, who can bring that authenticity. And you're going to need backing from the right studios, because a project like this is going to be a lot for some people to handle. But I believe in you, Marcus. I've seen what you can do when you're passionate. Let's get the ball rolling." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude and relief. With Daniel on his side, he had a foothold in making his vision a reality. "Thank you, D, really. I don't want to hold back on this one, and I'm going to need people who understand why it matters. I want people to feel what we've felt." "You've got me," Daniel said firmly. "Send over whatever you've written down so far, and we'll start piecing together a plan. I've got a few people in mind who might be the right fit for this." As they ended the call, Marcus felt the first glimmer of hope that this project could become more than just an idea. The wheels were already turning, and he knew that with each step he was moving closer to something transformative. He spent the rest of the morning writing, pouring his thoughts, experiences, and the vision of each vignette onto the page. He crafted scenes depicting microaggressions, tense silences, and casual dismissals, capturing the way they eroded self-worth, often unnoticed by those who weren't on the receiving end. Each story unfolded with a gritty authenticity that left him drained but exhilarated. This wasn't just going to be a film, it was a call to understand, to empathize, to feel the weight of these moments. By the time the afternoon rolled around, he had several pages of concepts, a handful of characters, and the start of a script that felt like his soul on paper. He knew he'd need the right actors, people who could channel these experiences with honesty and depth. For that, he wanted to reach out to Naomi Thomas, a brilliant actress he'd worked with on a few projects. Naomi was not only immensely talented but also vocal about her own experiences with racism and prejudice. He was certain she'd bring an authenticity to the project that no one else could. He shot her a quick message, and within minutes his phone rang. Marcus. What's going on? Naomi's voice was full of warmth, her energy always infectious. Hey Naomi, I have something I want to share with you, a project I've been working on. It's about our experiences, the ones people don't see or don't want to see. I want to create a series of vignettes that capture those moments, and I think you'd be perfect for one of the lead roles. Naomi was silent for a beat, absorbing his words. Marcus, that sounds powerful. Really powerful. But, are you sure you're ready for this? Putting something so personal out there. Marcus thought about it. He'd grappled with the same question himself. Was he ready to open up the darker parts of his life, to lay bare the moments that had hurt him, shaken him, and in some ways defined him? But then he remembered the driver, his look of shock and fear when he realized who Marcus was, and the surge of anger that had pushed him to start this project in the first place. I have to be, he replied, his voice steady. If not now, then when? This story needs to be told, and I think we're the ones who need to tell it. Naomi's voice softened. I'm with you. This is important, and I'd be honored to be a part of it. When can we start? They spent the next hour discussing the details, Naomi adding her own ideas, sharing her own stories that she thought could add to the narrative. By the end of the call, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, his vision becoming clearer with each new perspective and story shared. Over the next few weeks, Marcus's apartment transformed into a makeshift office, with scripts, storyboards, and notes covering every available surface. Daniel arranged meetings with production companies, and Marcus found himself pitching the project to executives, many of whom were intrigued but hesitant. The subject matter was raw, unfiltered, and as one executive put it, a little too real for some audiences. But Marcus didn't waver. He knew that too real was exactly what this project needed to be. Then, after what felt like endless meetings, calls, and negotiations, they finally secured a deal with a studio willing to take the risk. It wasn't a big studio, but it was a team that understood the vision, respected Marcus's passion, and was willing to give him the creative freedom he needed. With funding secured, they moved into the next phase, casting, scouting locations, and finalizing the script. Marcus worked tirelessly, overseeing every detail, driven by the memory of the cab ride that had sparked this journey. He poured his heart into each scene, each line, determined to create something that would resonate, something that would stay with people long after the credits rolled. As the days turned into weeks, the project began to take shape. Naomi brought a depth and vulnerability to her role that left Marcus awestruck, her portrayal so raw it brought tears to his eyes. Other cast members shared their own experiences, adding layers of authenticity that transformed the project into something much bigger than any of them had anticipated. It was no longer just Marcus's story, it was theirs. Finally, the day arrived when they shot the last scene. Marcus watched from behind the camera, his heart pounding as the final moments played out on screen. The actors moved with a grace and strength that spoke to the resilience of their characters, their performances a testament to the struggles they had all faced in one way or another. As the director called cut, a silence settled over the set. The crew and cast looked around, their faces reflecting the same sense of awe and relief that Marcus felt. They had done it. They had created something honest, something that would challenge audiences to confront the uncomfortable truths about race, prejudice, and resilience. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Thank you, everyone. You've all put a part of yourselves into this, and I can't express how much that means to me. This isn't just a film, it's a statement, a reminder that our stories matter. There was a ripple of applause, some cheers, and a few tears as the cast and crew embraced, sharing in the pride and relief of what they had accomplished together.